Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates, and here we are again, taking a stroll down the highways and byways, the country lanes of the counterculture. Now, if you take a walk down those British country lanes in search of counterculture, you meet some strange, odd characters, sometimes forgotten characters, and that's what we love here at the Bureau. And the subject of today's broadcast is one such, the mysterious, let's say, rogue archaeologist and mysteries writer C Lethbridge. Not a well-known name these days, but somebody who was influential in the counterculture in terms of alternative archaeology, dowsing, the uses of pendulums, intuitive ways of perceiving the world. And to guide us, to introduce us to Mr. C Lethbridge, we have with us another countercultural icon. He started off life in New York City, and then as a young man was polling the bass strings for that band Blondie. You may have heard of them, hanging out with Television and all sorts of other cool New York bands. But he gave up the bass for the pen or the typewriter, and he has become one of our foremost writers on the esoteric and the occult. So I'm very pleased to welcome an old friend, Gary Lachman. Hello, Gary.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure. Now, I gave a brief introduction to you then, but who is Gary Lachman? It's probably best if I don't butcher your bio.
You'll let me do that, right? Gary Lachman, I am a writer. Written quite a few books about the meeting point between consciousness culture and the Western esoteric tradition. And you might say, what's that? Well, this is his counter tradition to the mainstream Western intellectual tradition, which at one point wasn't a counter, it was part of it, but they bifurcated about 400 years ago. And the mainstream rationalist, scientific, materialist view has been dominant since then. But alongside it has been this kind of shadow tradition, which is this hermetic, meaning the tradition of magic and the occult and things of that sort. So I over the years, written quite a few books about that and biographies of several people that are some of the leading figures in that tradition.
You're being a little bit modest there, Gary. It's more than a few books, isn't it? Come on, how many is it?
Oh, I guess it's several. I mean, there's many. I don't know. I think I just sent off my 23rd, put it that way. And so there's 22 that are actually out. The most recent is called The Return of Holy Russia, which sort of looks at the history of Russia through that lens of this kind of counter-tradition.
Right. Well, and as I mentioned, you did trade in your bass guitar for the pen, the typewriter, the word processor, or computer, whatever it is that you use. And Gary, we're going to talk about this mysterious character, C Lethbridge. As I said, not a very well-known figure these days, maybe never was that, I suppose, but a figure nevertheless in that landscape of the counterculture. But before we get into his strange story, why don't you tell us, what does counterculture mean?
Oh, well, it used to be something about 60 years ago. I think... I don't know. I mean, there's many. It's sort of pluralistic. There isn't one counterculture anymore. But likened unto what I'm saying about this hermetic tradition, this kind of other or alternative tradition in the West, the counterculture, saying it started up, I don't know, sometime in the late 50s had its heyday in the 60s into the 70s, was an alternative to the mainstream, culture, bourgeois, workaday, everyday Protestant work ethic reality. And I guess by the into the 80s, that broke open into a variety of different multicultures. I guess the particular mystical side or the magical side of the counterculture, which I've written about. My first book was called Turn Off Your Mind. The Mystic 60s and the Dark Side of the Age of Aquarius is a kind of revisionist history of the 60s, but it focuses on how occult and mystical and magical ideas dominated the popular culture in the 1960s into the early 70s. But it kind of, that itself broke down into different things by the mid-70s, where you have kind of the rock, hot, and roll, as I call it, in the kind of heavy metal world. and then you have kind of the beginning of what became the New Age in the 80s. And today it's the mind, body, spirit. It's a whole industry out there. So there isn't one counterculture anymore, I would say, in terms of a kind of popular culture. There's a variety of different kind of subcultures that are all proliferating, rather than one kind of opposition to the mainstream.
Yeah, that's interesting. The idea that counterculture has sort of transformed itself into multiculture or into subculture. But I've got this idea about counterculture, which is that there's always been a counterculture. Whenever there's been a culture, it's sort of a bit like a kind of shadow version of. When we talk about the counterculture, we mean the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, right?
Well, I mean, I guess you could push it back, and people could say, well, there were whoever it was in before the Beats, there was the existentialists or something in the 40s, and then before them you had the lost or the swinging, the 20s and the roaring 20s and so on, and back to the 19th century with poets like Baudelaire. And I would say though it's sort of, I mean, it all depends, how you want to define it. I mean, there's always been sects that have been, unorthodox and so on, but they're not necessarily a whole kind of culture. They're a particular kind of, religion or practices that you engage in. But the reason I would focus in on, say, the 50s and the 60s, obviously the 60s. I mean, I was a kid and it was all happening out there. It was in TV commercials. It was something that was, the counterculture was quickly co-opted, or the idea of the counterculture was, quickly co-opted by, marketing, and which is very brilliant at doing anything like that. It gets a hold of it pretty quickly. But it was something that was widespread, and I guess in earlier times it was smaller. You had the very say in the 1890s, into early 20th century, you had many of the same interests that I've written about in the context of the counterculture, about the magic and the occult and the supernatural, and even like back to nature and free love and even feminism. These things were very, very popular and progressive in 1890s into the early 1900s. But they weren't on a wide. I mean, there was a lot of people, but it wasn't sort of a whole generation sort of doing it. They were still on the fringe, on the margin. And I would say today, many of the ideas that and practices that we associate with the counterculture from this time, 50s, 60s into the 70s, have become domesticated and part of our mainstream culture. So it's become absorbed. I mean, I guess individuals can have a certain kind of counterculture, but there isn't like one particular sort of, I belong to these guys rather than those. If you smoked pot back then, you belonged to the in crowd, and if you didn't, you were with the straights and that kind of thing. Very, very simplistic.
Yeah, that's the sort of recurring theme, isn't it? The way that the culture sort of sucks up the counterculture, kind of absorbs it and commercializes it, particularly in the advertising industry. I love that final episode of the series Mad Men. I don't know if you watched that.
I watched some of the episodes,
But in it, the protagonist, Dan Draper, spoiler alert, by the way, if you don't know the end, he sort of leaves it all behind in New York, the New York advertising industry, and sets off across America to sort of discover himself on a motorbike. And he ends up in California and in a place, I guess, like Esalen, the New Age Center, and he's meditating and, doing kind of various Gestalt therapy and stuff like that. But one day he's out on the terrace sort of meditating, and he has this bright idea, and it's the Coca-Cola advert, "I like to teach the world to sing," which is a kind of classic way that that whole countercultural vision was taken into commercial America, and then with great commercial results, right?
I mean, as far as something that was real alternative and different, it probably lasted until about 65 or so. I mean, there was the famous death of the hippie in 1966. The Diggers in San Francisco, they had this whole ritual performance of the death of the hippie, because by then there were tourist buses going down into the Haight and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, but this is inevitable, and I guess in one sense, not only in that way the counterculture, but one reason why, let's say, many kind of movements in the arts became so arcane and strange and out there is that they were trying to sabotage any attempt to be enculturated into the mainstream. But even like surrealism, which was the strangest thing ever, when it hit The shopping bags with, Ernst on them and stuff like that. No, this is no denigration of Ernst or the surrealists. It's just that everything gets absorbed and it becomes part of fashion in that kind of way. And so it's hard not to. I mean, I remember back in my day, you mentioned when I was a musician back in New York, and New York wasn't into the safety pins, but it eventually, it just osmosis, it was happening over there. But when you could go, there's a place called Fiorucci, and this is like one of the first places they were selling ripped clothing, pre-ripped clothing, and it's kind of like, okay, it's sort of like, that's it, it's kind of, it's over, it's over now, so.
We had Barry Kane in for an episode, and Barry was the punk journalist for a defunct music magazine called Record Mirror.
All right.
And he's also written a great book about the punk years, which, of course, as he says, there was only two of them. They lasted for 2 years, really, the main punk era. But, of course, it's been traded on ever since, for the last 30 years or whatever it is. There's been sort of, punk things going on. But that was it. Just a very short, bright burst of ferocious energy, and then it was done.
Well, I mean, that's it. It's always just before the great successes happen, because then you've jumped, you made that quantum leap. You're in the other orbit, and it's very different. And you can't, if you want to really compete in that new world, you can't really maintain the same innocence and naivete and freshness. But just before, I mean, again, for me, New York, 75, 76, just before people were getting all the record deals was when it was really exciting at CBGB, because there was just a lot of stuff. And every night there was a great band playing. And all the bands were different. They all sounded different. There wasn't one sound that later it became, this is the punk sound or whatever. There wasn't, because the Ramones are very different than Television, who is very different than Blondie and different than Talking Heads and so on and all that. So, I mean, this was this wonderful, creative time. And of course, I have nostalgia for it. I was still in my teens and all that. But no, I think that was one of the, and also had the strange blend of the art and rock. You had the Rimbaud, you're talking about counterculture. So Patti Smith is making all these homages to Rimbaud, French symbolist poet from the 19th century, and it's kind of linking up to that, and then these 3 chords, very simple. I mean, the thing about that time, if I can just say this, is that it was also around the same time that there was this great nostalgia in mainstream rock for the early 50s stuff, because everything became top-heavy with Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes and these Wagnerian bands, and people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis are having comebacks. And there's a group called Sha Na Na that did all the old doo-wop stuff and all that. And it was like back to roots, and that was what was happening in New York too. It was like simple 3-chord, high energy with...
Yeah, so you were playing bass for Blondie, as I mentioned, and with all those bands that you mentioned then, was there a sense that it was this kind of scene, you were part of a community of something that was happening?
No, I mean, everybody knew something was happening. It didn't have a name. I mean, it was New York rock, underground rock. I mean, it wasn't called punk until it was Punk Magazine came out, and then that kind of, it's an easy, and then this is the thing, okay, it's road to success, but then everybody who could put a safety pin and pour a beer over their head, was a punk. And it was, okay. I mean, before that, it was more like a Fellini movie at CBGB, because everybody had dark glasses on and nobody barely clapped or did anything after anybody played. It was kind of, trying to out-cool each other. And then it was like, it's like, who are these thugs and hooligans who turned up here? So it was very, very different. But yes, it was absolutely exciting. It was incredible. And it all happened in a small part of town, too, on the east side of New York, because everybody lived relatively close. I mean, the Blondie loft was just a few blocks away from CBGB. The Ramones lived a block away or around the corner, and Talking Heads were not too far. And you'd run into everybody, on 2nd Avenue and St. Mark's Place and all that. So, yeah, it was incredible. It was, it's nothing like that now. I mean, it's just really no evidence of that. Although I have to say, when I was last there, I did, as one does, I did walk through the old neighborhood. And the only thing that remained untouched, everything else is unrecognizable. It's all done up, fancy, hotels and cafes where, the people who made the place could never have gone into ever, not even to use the loo. And the one place that's not done up is where the Blondie loft was. It still has all graffiti on the door, and it's still like this dump. So I thought that was apt. That was good. So any case,
which street was that?
Oh, that was the Bowery. Yeah, Bowery, south of Houston, 266 Bowery. So I mean, everyone's going to go there, and I hope please. I hope the people who live there, they're not bothered. If people want to go and bang on the door or something like that.
I was actually in the Lower East Side when they were dismantling CBGB, redeveloping the building. I'm not quite sure what's there now, but I think the entire interior got shipped out to San Diego or something.
Yeah, it's a club somewhere. I mean, there's a overpriced clothes store there now that has all the stuff that it wasn't about, like, neon and guitars and motorcycle, all the kind of stuff that if you're on Rodeo Drive or anywhere else, Regent Street, you'd walk into, it'd just be some clothes shop, but it's like all this stuff is like, I don't know, you can't go home again. It's just not there anymore.
For sure. I love that line though, that clapping was frowned upon. So sort of any sort of display of enthusiasm or emotion was greeted with frowns. It was so cool. You had to be cool the whole time.
Total dominance kind of thing. You couldn't give in an inch.
Love it. Well, listen, we're supposed to be talking about C Lethbridge.
Yeah, I know.
But I've got a sort of segue from these tales of the post-punk era into Lethbridge, because the person that I first heard about Lethbridge through was Julian Cope, as in Teardrop Explodes, etc. And Julian Cope himself, of course, massively got into archaeology, prehistoric archaeology, wrote 2 books about it, great books actually. And he talked about Lethbridge, both as an archaeologist and as a sort of, a centre of those Earth Mysteries movement. But why don't you, for anybody who's not heard of him, which is most of us, I think, give us a sort of brief bio?
Well, T.C. Lethbridge was a Cambridge archaeologist, and for many years he was the curator at Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Cambridge. And it was a post that he wasn't paid for. It was voluntary. He came from a well-off family. And he had a unconventional style and approach, very personal approach to archaeology. And later years, though, after he retired in the late 50s, he started writing a series of books about the paranormal. And he's most known today, if he's known at all, as you say, for his work with pendulums, which came out of his work with dowsing. And, dowsing is when you use a dowsing rod, or you can use like a stick or a branch or something, and you detect water. You can do the same thing with the pendulum, which some kind of bob at the end and at the end of a string. But although, many people recognize, okay, you dowse for water, and this is maybe some kind of natural talent or something like that. But it's you can dowse with just practically anything, at least according to many reports. And Lethbridge just started a series of experiments, and he expanded it into a whole kind of system of different levels and dimensions of reality, different kinds of time, and he also he wrote these they're fun to read because they're short. And he has a very breezy, casual kind of style. And this was something I suspect he also had when he was at Cambridge, and it didn't serve him in good stead with many of the more orthodox dons there. But I should say, just a strange segue from what we just were talking about is I actually got thrown out of David Bowie's loft once in Manhattan in 1980 because of something about Lethbridge. Which I only realized after the fact it was about Lethbridge, but I'll tell you, it's a very short story. Because I got thrown out, but I had met Bowie a couple times already, and because the first Blondie tour we opened for Iggy Pop, and he was playing in Iggy's band, and on a couple of occasions. So I just got invited.
Bowie was playing in Iggy Pop's band.
Yeah, he played incognito. He was playing keyboards, and this was '77. So and he drove to every gig. He didn't fly. So the car that he is in, the man who fell to earth, was driving him from gig to gig. But any case, this is 1980, a few years later, and I got invited to some, do at his loft in Midtown Manhattan. So I was there, and he was holding court and so on. And there was kind of a lull in the conversation, and I suspect that they had been talking about the occult because he was into it. He read lots of stuff like that, and so somebody said, "Oh, Gary knows about the occult because he reads Colin Wilson, and Colin Wilson is the great British writer, a big influence on my life and work, and I've also written a book about him. And it was also through Wilson that I came to know of Lethbridge's work, because he writes at length about Lethbridge in a book called Mysteries that came out in 1978." And I had read that, so I'm at this party, and someone says, "Oh, Gary knows about the occult because he reads Colin Wilson." And Bowie says, "Colin Wilson, yes, he traces pentagrams on the doors of people's houses, and he heads a coven in Cornwall." And I hadn't met Wilson by then, but I'd certainly read a bit, and I said, I don't think he does that, no. And then something about, gets the ectoplasm from Nazis, and Bowie was really going off on a tangent about this kind of thing. And I just said, "Well, David, I don't think he actually does that." "Oh, yes, he does." "No, I don't think he does." And I, had the temerity to kind of, tell him basically in the kindest way possible that he didn't know what he was talking about. And Bowie had these two female bodyguards at the time. They're like Thumper and Bambi from one of the last Sean Connery Bond films. I forget which one it is exactly, but any case, they come over to me and they say, "David's very tired. We think it's time. We think it's time you went home." So how Lethbridge figures into this is that I later realized that the references Bowie was making was actually to something Wilson had written about Lethbridge in the beginning of this book, Mysteries. Because the first few chapters it's basically a small book about Lethbridge. And the first chapter is about Lethbridge living in Devon, in this whole house in Branscombe. And he realizes that his neighbor is a witch. This elderly, eccentric lady is a witch. And how he realizes that is that she teaches, they get into a conversation and she somehow teaches him how to make pentagrams as a kind of protection. She says something like, "Oh, I've come by," she astral travels or something like that, and says, "I've come by your house and I see you don't have any protection. If you want to protect yourself from da-da-da, you need to do this." And Lethbridge was, very empirical, experimental, and he's, "Okay, I'll try anything. Let's see what happens." And so he somehow taught himself how to visualize, and it's very easy to do, visualize pentagrams, and sort of saw them at the cardinal points around his bed or something like that. And this is, Wilson starts out this book, Mysteries. So I assume now that Bowie had somehow blended the two things together, that Wilson's account of this witch teaching Lethbridge how to draw the pentagrams turned into Wilson making pentagrams around people's houses in Cornwall and having a coven. I mean, his life should be so exciting because he mostly lived and wrote all the time. But so there's a crossover into. But yeah, that's how I first came to know Lethbridge, was that from reading this book, Mysteries.
But I think listeners are going to want to know if there's a happy ending to your Bowie story. Did you kiss and make up?
I don't think I've talked to him since then, and sadly it's passed. But no, it's one of those strange claims to fame,
So yeah. Lethbridge, I mean, he's a little bit like you, Gary. I mean, he wrote a lot of books, and I feel that we're sort of circling him a bit, like a pendulum sort of swinging around the subject, as it were, before we centre in on it. So, as you said, he had this role at Cambridge as the keeper of Anglo-Saxon antiquities, an honorary role. He didn't need it for the money. And in fact, I've got a friend, actually, who's the keeper of medicine at the Science Museum. Sort of interesting position to hold. And of course, he's an archaeologist, but he's never a straightforward, standard academic by the book archaeologist. He's always moving to some degree on his own current, acting out of intuition, off the page, as it were, in the field. And of course, he starts to excite quite a bit of controversy with some of the discoveries that he says he's made.
Well, there's quite a few things. I mean, even the paranormal stuff started early on. He tells a story about coming across a ghost in one of his friend's chambers. He was leaving his friend's chamber, and he saw someone walk in, and he was surprised that he was getting another visitor. And the next day or whatever, he said, "Oh, I bumped into your friend, who was that?" And he said, I don't know who you're talking about. And then he realized that the fellow was all dressed out in some kind of hunting kit or something. And then he has the story of the ghoul on the staircase, which was a strange kind of presence that inhabited a staircase in one of the chorister schools. And he again left. This is like 1922, 24, something like that. So he's in his early 20s, he sees one of the headmasters, and the master's all depressed, and he said, "Oh, the ghoul is on the stair again," and so being a very brave young student there, he and a friend went to confront it, and they talk about sort of walking up the stairs, and this later became something 30 years later when he had left Cambridge's and down in Devon, that he started to work on again. But I guess the thing about his archaeological career is that he sort of had his own way of doing things, and I get the impression, like I said, it was sort of how do you even say it? I want to say breezy, but that may give the impression of being kind of irresponsible and not serious. Now, I don't think that's the case, but I think he was like Wittgenstein in the sense that Wittgenstein hated Cambridge, and he hated all the kind of stuffiness, the high tea, whatever it is, high table, and everything being very buttoned down and all that. And I'm trying to think the dates, because I wonder if they would have. I mean, he would have been a student. I mean, obviously Wittgenstein would have been teaching or whatever, but they probably don't cross at that time. But there's a similar kind of sense where they didn't really fit in, to like what was kind of the orthodox way of doing things there.
Do you think those early paranormal experiences with ghosts and ghouls, which if you had those as a young person, they would sort of materially influence you? So do you think that background of something other was affecting the way that he came to archaeology? So, which of course, those kind of experiences, I imagine, wouldn't have been met with much welcome at Cambridge, where they may be regarded with derision or cynicism. But if he's actually had them and they're real to him, then it's going to affect the way he goes about things. And so, of course, when he gets in the field, he starts to work in this kind of intuitive way, which is always would be regarded as being unorthodox, right?
No, but that's the best archaeologists are the ones who do that. Schliemann and Arthur Evans, they know somehow, some weird way, they know exactly where to go. And I guess that's the thing that finally made him disgusted with Cambridge was, years later when he discovered the Wandlebury giant. And he went. It's like the giant at Cerne Abbas or the great horse of Uffington. It's this fantastic carving into a hillside. And Lethbridge believed there was one. There was a legend about it being there, and he had heard the legends, and he took these legends seriously, in the sense that yes, you can scoff, but there is bound to be some element of truth to start it in the first place. And things grow and so on and so on. So, but by the time he started hearing about the legend of there was like a golden chariot and a great horse and other figures and legends and stories and fables about this. By the time he had heard this, it opened a lot of different stuff. A lot of stuff had accreted around the original kind of nut of what was actually there. But he believed that there was something there, and he went, and to his satisfaction, he found it. He famously took this kind of steel spike or a pike and shoved it through the turf, and his argument was that the turf would be deeper where the carving was, simply, because it carved out, and the turf would have had to grow, as much to fill up the whole of the carving, and then some. And so he went around doing that, and he believed that he had, but this was completely contentious, and he was attacked and criticized by his peers and so on. And I mean, the two. Genius is the last place, I would say, to go is in a university, especially these days. I'm sure it was bad back then, but I would say these days it's of course that's why I stay out of them myself. But no, but
he gets out on the hillside. He's got this. He's drawing on mythology. He's drawing on his kind of feelings, on his instincts. He takes his pike, his metal thing out there, and it's a little bit like, well, obviously dowsing and pendulums became a big thing for him later. So he's responding to something in the earth, and he pricks out this shape, peels back the turf, reveals this figure, or is it figure?
There's three figures. There's a Earth Mother, kind of sun god, and there's a kind of another figure. I think is a sort of moon god or something. I may be mixing them up.
But he's immediately accused by the academic orthodoxy, the archaeological academic orthodoxy, of kind of making this up. That he's kind of drawn them on the hillside, that they're not really there, and all this stuff is kind of nonsense, really. But in other quarters, his approach and his discoveries are received very warmly. Actually, isn't that right?
The thing about Lethbridge is he anticipated quite a few things that later became very big after his death, like the Earth Mysteries thing. I mean, he died just on the cusp of that. John Michel's book, View Over Atlantis, had just come out in 1969. And it was just, the whole ley line thing was just kind of taking off when Lethbridge died in 1971. And he doesn't really talk about ley lines, but he certainly talks about earth mysteries, and he certainly talks about megaliths and standing stones and all of that sort of thing. But yes, and he also took seriously, this was the other, bad mark against him, was that he was friends with Margaret Murray, the great, she started out as an Egyptologist. She was a student of Flinders Petrie. And who's the great Egyptologist, and then from that she went on to study witchcraft, and she wrote the famous book Witch Cult in Western Europe, which argued that basically witchcraft, Wicca, is the vestigial remains of this ancient pagan pre-Christian fertility religion. It's called Wicca, and it's been handed down. It sort of, we're saying counterculture. You could say there's a kind of they didn't call it that, but, some people could, here's this counter matriarchal or feminine, or it's not patriarchal, it's not male and logical, it's the solar, it's the lunar kind of tradition. So going back, far earlier than Christianity and so on. And by the time his work on Gog and Magog, in the book in which he talks about the Wandleberry giant, that comes out in the sort of mid-50s, her prestige has dimmed quite a bit, and she's not taken seriously anymore. But she gives her imprimatur to his work, and he's also in that camp, and he becomes fascinated with the pre-Christian pagan gods of ancient Britain, and this one thing leads to the other. And I think the thing about Lethbridge is that it's sort of, he does kind of follow the leads. It's not like he has a theory and then he wants to establish that and, fight that corner. It's like, let's see where this goes. Let's see where that goes. And along the way, he's always saying, I could be perfectly wrong here. I'm the last qualified person to do this. But in any case, let's see what happens. And you don't have to agree with him, but he certainly opens up, avenues of thought. And so he was sort of presaging the whole Earth Mysteries thing, which would take over in certainly by the mid-70s.
So he becomes completely disenchanted with life at Cambridge, and is in the fortunate position of having enough money, independently wealthy, to leave it all behind. He doesn't leave archaeology behind, does he? But he becomes sort of Lethbridge too. Sort of steps into this role as writer about the paranormal and investigator, I suppose. He was like a kind of writer and investigator.
Sort of parapsychologist, I guess, although, again, he probably wouldn't have called himself that. I mean, he talked about the odd, and this is the general kind of, or, what, if people know who Charles Fort is, Charles Fort, Fortean, Charles Fort wrote, he's probably more known than Lethbridge these days, but in the early 20th century, 1920s, he wrote these huge, unreadable books about all these strange things that happened. He haunted the libraries of New York and London, and I mean, there's a plaque for him down in sort of Bloomsbury, or just down the street from the British Library. And he found all these things, and it's sort of like, explain that, rains of fishes, and flying cities, and all this kind of stuff. So Lethbridge isn't quite out that weird, but he is kind of trailing these clues that he finds, and one thing leads to another. And he basically finds out that he can dowse, and this becomes this fascinating thing for him. And then he learns, again, you could do it with the pendulum. And the thing with the pendulum, you can get more precision to a certain degree. And I mean, this is what happens. And he starts just purely experimentally wanting to see if this works. And long story short, he comes to his kind of first scientific conclusion or fact about this new world that he's exploring, through the pendulum, is that everything has its own rate, and the rate is the length of the string holding, the bob of the pendulum. So, you have something, whatever it is at the bottom, and, and you've got a string somehow attached to it. And most people just use a short kind of pendulum. I mean, I did this ages ago. I mean, when I was first reading Lethbridge, I was trying all this kind of stuff. But you use a short kind of pendulum, and you can, it sort of just swings back and forth. But then when it reacts in a certain way, responds to whatever you're looking for, or a question you ask or something, it'll start to gyrate in a circular kind of motion. And what Lethbridge was discovering was that different substances, the pendulum would go into the gyrating, circular motion at different lengths of the string. And he also found that the other deciding factor, so you have the length of the string, the other deciding factor is the number of the rotations, the number of the gyrations. And through those two coordinates, he was able to map out a whole kind of system of different substances. But not only, substances like iron, or he searches for silver, or he searches for lead. I mean, he's an archaeologist, so he's always finding things in the soil. If he's digging up things, he'll find some old pottery or something like that. And a pendulum would be like the magic bullet, to mix metaphors, for an archaeologist, because one thing an archaeologist would really like to have is X-ray vision. You can just look through the soil and see if anything's there. Otherwise, I'm going to be digging here for hours and there's nothing. But Lethbridge, what he discovered was that he would be able to have the pendulum, at the length of whatever he was looking for. So it was a piece of silver or lead or gold or whatever, and then in one hand, and then he would move his pointer out across the field, and whenever his finger pointed at the substance he was looking for, the pendulum would start to do this kind of thing. And he said that the pendulum acts just like an indicator on some kind of meter. It has no power itself. The power is somehow the human mind. Our mind somehow has this ability to locate these things. And not only substances, and this was the strange thing too, because it would also react to abstract ideas. It would react to anger, love, hate. All of these notions had their own rate, and they were connected. And he came to see that there were all these correspondences. And in his own way, he kind of rediscovered a basic theme of the Hermetic tradition I was talking about. This is the notion of correspondences, that things somehow are connected to each other. And, this would be through analogy or metaphor. We consider this a kind of poetry, but they actually, in terms of these vibrations, the rotations of the pendulum, all these things, so like the color black and death and cold and sleep would have similar rates. And this is very much along the lines of the whole Hermetic tradition or the Kabbalistic tradition, where you have certain colors and sounds and plants and minerals and planets all are connected in some kind of strange way. Which modern rational science says this is all rubbish. This is just kind of analogical thinking. But things aren't really connected. They're connected by cause and effect. They're not connected by similarity. But no, this tradition says no. And Lethbridge believed that he had found a scientific basis for that. So if you held the pendulum over something that was, black, or something that was dead, or someone that was asleep, or something that was cold, it would react at the same length of the string, the same, at 40, whatever it is, right? And then each of those things would have its own gyration. So you could differentiate between them through the number of times the pendulum swung in a circle, but the length of the string at which it would react at all would be the same. And so just for him, and he tested it, and his wife tested it, and others as well. And it's, for him, it was kind of mapping out the radiations. And what he's saying is that somehow our own, I should say, he talks about a kind of cone of radiation coming around each object, each thing. So whatever it is, each thing has a kind of, we can't perceive it with our senses. It's on another level of reality. We can't see it or taste it or touch it, something like that. But some part of our mind is able to react to it, or is in reaction with it already. And the pendulum acts as a kind of meter. Because for some reason, the conscious me who wants this information can't just go to the superconscious me and say, hey, what is that? It won't just come that way. You have to go through a kind of relay, which is sort of some other medium. The medium is, it could be the dowsing rod, it could be the pendulum, a related kind of phenomenon is what's called psychometry, which is where people can tell something about the past of an object or some substance, or it could be wrapped in something they don't know what it is, and they can hold it, and then they can get images of something, and then you find out, oh, this is exactly what it was. So if you someone you didn't know what it was, volcanic glass or something, then I've seen eruptions and lava and so on. Oh my God, that's what it is. So a similar kind of thing. So the idea is that rather than the subconscious, unconscious Freudian basement, there's a superconscious. We're in the middle. We're like on the ground floor. There's the basement, and then there's I want to say the attic, but the attic, it's not dusty. It's actually much better. It's like a huge penthouse up there, open to the sky. And up there, it has all this information. But we in the middle can't get it directly. So somehow the pendulum works as an indicator of that.
And he was mapping the territory then, wasn't he? He was kind of developing this system, which he was using himself, because he's down. By this time, he's down in Devon. He's married. He can afford to live in a rather nice house in Branscombe. And he's investigating the local landscape. Wherever he went, he was investigating. He was always remained the amateur archaeologist, digging things up. And he became I suppose he always was, but he investigated stone circles and prehistoric monuments. And didn't he start to develop theories about them using the system?
Oh yeah, he was one of the ones to. Again, one of the things with Lethbridge is he didn't read other people's books, so he wasn't aware of a lot of stuff that was happening. That's what makes it also interesting too, because he's discovering these things just as many ways just before they become really big, or at the same time. So one of the things that he's talking about in a book called Legends of the Sons of God is the whole idea of ancient aliens, the whole idea that at some time in the human past, the prehistoric past, aliens, extraterrestrials, beings from another dimension or whatever, people not us, came and either mated or genetically, experimented with the primates that were here, or the early humans that were here, and somehow gave a kickstart to human evolution. And with the megaliths and the standing stones, he believed that. He accepted the idea that they were astronomical. This was something that was, Gerald Hawkins was talking about this. Alexander Thom, again, this is part of the Earth Mysteries thing. But he took the next step, too, that people like Jean-Michel will be talking about in View Over Atlantis, that these ley lines or these, earthworks are all connected, that they're not only markers, even though Lethbridge said, these things can't be seen from the sea, but they can be seen from up above. Perhaps they're, landmarks for saucers or whatever to land. But also they somehow were able to contain the kind of power that he came to know through his experiments with the paranormal, because we talked about earlier his experience with the ghost and the ghoul, and this was something else that he was able to kind of discover in the same way he was working with the pendulum. And he had this idea that, ghosts were sort of tape recordings in a way. Strong emotions could impress themselves on, the surrounding. Again, it's a kind of variant in psychometry. And the stone tape theory, yeah. And then the other thing, and in the case of a ghost, it's actually, you can actually see the person who is there. They're like a television recording. The ghoul is more just like a bad feeling. It's kind of like a psychic smell, that inhabits a kind of field. And he's talking in terms of electrical and magnetic fields. These are some ways, this is the medium for these kind of phenomena to happen. But he's also interested in things like poltergeists and things of that sort. And that's a much more active, explosive kind of power where, telekinesis, psychokinesis, things are thrown across the room and things like that. And he believes that in ancient times, and this was also part of this notion of this ancient, pre-Christian religion that he associates with witchcraft, the stones were somehow able to, they could be charged with this kind of psychic energy or this bioelectrical energy he talks about. And the witches or whoever, back in the day, they have raves at the stones, and they just run around the stones a lot and generate a lot of this energy, and the energy would go into the stones. Because he himself, when he was dowsing or when he was using a pendulum, and I think it's at the Merry Maidens or somewhere else, where he puts his hand on one of the stones, he feels this tingling. He feels this kind of vibration. And he felt, well, why not? Could it be the case that somehow the energy that poltergeists use, or the kind of psychic energy, can be stored in these stones? And that would be a way, not only the physical marker for the ships to see, they could somehow hone in on it in some kind of psychic way. So, and again, these are a lot of ideas he kind of throws off. I mean, at the same time that he was writing this book that nobody read at the time, Eric von Däniken, the Swiss guy who wrote, Chariots of the Gods and tons of other books, all about ancient aliens. The books are horribly written. They're full of mistakes, but he has this insistent, table thumping kind of style, and he went on to make millions of dollars. I don't know if he's still alive these days or not. But Lethbridge almost destroyed his book when he heard about Däniken, because he thought, he had beaten him to the punch, and he in the end said no. He decided not to, and he published it. But again, he was doing this stuff just before it became really, really widely popular. Lethbridge speculated that the stone circles, the megaliths, could be kind of batteries, in a way they could house this bioelectric or psychic energy that would be given off by the people dancing, or a variety of different rituals and things like that. And again, he likens it onto like acupuncture, and this is something that Jean-Michel would sort of say on his book as well. So it's interesting because Michel got picked up, obviously got picked up by the counterculture. And you talk about he put Glastonbury on the map, and he was friends with the Stones, and they used to go ley line hunting and looking for UFOs and things like that. And although I don't know if Lethbridge would have, he was quite happy just to stay at home down in Devon. So I think he stayed at Cambridge Dawn to that degree. I don't think he would have been picked up by the counterculture.
That's interesting because some of the most recent theories about big monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, the prehistoric circles, share some of that. There's the Australian Dr. Lynn Kelly. She has talked about them in terms of memory repositories, and also based on her work with Aboriginal tribes in Australia, that the actual ditches themselves were these sort of places for celebration and big events using singing. And that there is something in the architecture of the ditch which can reinforce that sonic energy in a way that kind of brings all sorts of other things into play. So he was anticipating that, and it's a bit of a shame that he hasn't really been credited with more of his ideas than he has at the moment. Who was it who has sort of kept him alive, in our memory?
Colin Wilson, who did a lot to, introduce Lethbridge to people. He himself, one of the reasons why he wrote, several chapters about him in this book, Mysteries, was that he became aware of his work after his big book, The Occult, that came out like 1971, which was one of the big books to, big bestsellers in the occult boom then. And he name checks one of Lethbridge's books in there. But subsequent to that, he read the other ones and he realized, he was brilliant and all that. I mean, one of the he didn't really read any. I mean, this occasional reference to Jung or something like that, but he doesn't really. And that's an interesting thing where the same idea is happening around the same time. This kind of non-locality. I mean, the book in the early '60s called "The Morning Magicians." I think it was "The Dawn of Magic" here. Howells and Berger, they're one of the first ones to talk about the ancient aliens kind of thing. And Arthur C. Clarke, he has a short story, The Sentinel, and 2001 is based on that and all that. But no, I mean, I don't think too many people read him. I think his time in any kind of popular way was sort of late '70s, early '80s when the Earth Mysteries things was happening. Because when you asked me about this, I said, a coincidence because I recently written a bit about Lethbridge, but it was about one of the last things he wrote about was dreams, and he was working on a book about dreams towards the end of his life when he died. He had a heart problem, and again, this was a new area he was going into. One of his publisher asked him would you be interested in doing a book about dreams, and at first he said, well, I don't think so. I don't think I dream that much. But then he just decided, and he followed up a fellow in the 1920s, J.W. Dunn, he wrote a book called Experiment with Time, and you might remember about last year when I gave a talk at Brompton Cemetery. I talked about this a bit, and the fundamental idea of this book was that Dunn realized that bits and pieces of the future were turning up in his dreams. And he kept recording them and noticing. And long story short, he came up with this very strange metaphysical idea about time and different levels of time to explain the fact that, bits and pieces of the future were coming into his dreams. And he said, if you can prove this for yourself, all you have to do is write your dreams down and pay attention to what happens. And I did this. Lethbridge did it, and I've been recently writing a book about this. That's why he came into this, and it's a shame that he died when he did. I mean, obviously, but still, because he didn't really get as far into this work as he might have. But even in the earlier work with the pendulum, he proposed that what he called the second whorl of the spiral, and he sort of saw reality as this kind of spiral, and the level we're at of physical reality. And physical things is sort of the first whorl, and then up above is what he called this timeless realm, where future and past and present are all continuous at the same time, and it's a very strange world. But in our dreams we kind of enter this strange timeless realm, and everything's a bit mixed up. And so we can have dreams, stuff from the past in it, and then, stuff in the future. But unless you really pay attention to the dreams and sift through them, we won't notice it. And most of the time, it's not, future dreams. It's usually some catastrophe, or, every now and then you can dream the winner of the Kentucky Derby or something like that. But most of them are pretty trivial. The fact that they are precognitive is what makes them interesting. They're not usually about anything interesting themselves. But again, he applied the same kind of scientific, empirical, experimental method where he wrote them down. He had different theories about them. He had a kind of dream kind of classification. I mean, one of the strange dreams he talks about is the backward dream. He talks about seeing his cat walk into their room backwards, and he didn't know what it was. The kind of furry snake comes in first, and then it attaches some weird thing, and it's like, oh no, it's the cat.
So in some ways, I suppose that connects him with like that Aboriginal culture of Dreamtime, which is, very landscape-based as well, and precognition and narrative. For a contemporary reader, he wrote a lot of stuff, Gary. Is he still worth reading? And if he is worth reading, where should somebody start if they wanted to delve into the world of C Lethbridge? Yeah,
I think he's still worth reading. I said it's very casual style, and he has a good sense of humor too, and he's very disarming. There is, I don't know if it's still in print, but there was the Essential C Lethbridge, which was a compilation of his work put together by a fellow named Tom Graves, who worked with pendulums as well, and Janet Holt, and Colin Wilson wrote the foreword to that. I don't know how many of his books are still in print. I mean, there was one called The Power of the Pendulum. It's one of the last things he did. This is the books about the dream. And, I mean, if you want to get a good I mean, in a way, I would say read Colin Wilson's book Mysteries, which is still in print. I mean, the first 3 chapters, and that'll give you a good overview. And then what he does is what Lethbridge didn't do. He connects Lethbridge's work with lots of other people. I mean, this book came out in 1978, so it's 40 years old or whatever, but still, it's still an exciting, thrilling book, and it's about the paranormal investigation that was going on at the time and consciousness exploration going on at the time. And Wilson is very good at linking up, different areas and avenues of exploration and this sort of thing. So I would say there, but I mean, of his own books, they're all very short. They're only about 100 pages. There's one called The Monkey's Tail, which is about his criticisms of Darwin. Darwinian, because the fundamentally for Lethbridge, he believes that the universe is meaningful. He believes there is some kind of pattern, there's some kind of intelligence at work in it. So he's at odds with the reigning reductionist view of the universe, which is absolutely meaningless. 15 billion years ago, less than nothing exploded for no reason, and that's why we're having this conversation. So he thought maybe otherwise. And again, it's presented in this kind of really kind of friendly kind of way. Take it or leave it. He's not trying to convince, but if you're interested, he'll show you his ideas.
So there you have it, the strange story, the strange life of C Lethbridge, a lesser known but nevertheless fascinating character walking through the landscapes of the counterculture. But that's for Lethbridge, Gary. What about you? Where can people find you and all these 23 books that you've been writing over the years?
Well, I have a blog. It's just my name, GaryLachman.co.uk. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. There's lots of videos on YouTube and interviews and things like that, so I'm not that hard to find. And my books, I guess, are available at all local bookshops and good online purveyors.
I think we should get you back to talk about Colin Wilson.
I'd love to do that.
And perhaps, yeah, that'd be great, wouldn't it? And perhaps also the darkening of the hippie dream. That's another one of your topics. What are you working on next?
Well, I just putting the finishing touches to a book about precognitive dreams and synchronicities. The spur for that was that talk I gave last year. Because I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but after that talk the next day, because at the end of the talk I said, look, if you want to see if you have dreams of the future, all you have to do is just write down your dreams and pay attention, see what happens during the day. And the next day on Twitter, someone had sent me a message and had posted, and she said, OMG, it's true. And she said, I was at this great talk. And yeah, I wrote down my dreams, and this is what happened. And she dreamt that she had picked a hedgehog up off the road and put it on the pavement, to get it out of harm's way. And the first thing she saw in her Twitter feed was a post about how to protect hedgehogs. Keep hedgehogs safe.
There you go.
So it's not exactly it, but it's subject to what I call symbolic distortion, because dreams speak in symbols, but it's close enough. It's close enough,
yeah. Well, yeah. I'm hoping that I'm going to have a precognitive dream about you joining us at London Month of the Dead later in the year. But thank you so much for that meeting with C Lethbridge, and of course walking us through your thoughts on the counterculture and telling us about your encounter with David Bowie and his bodyguards. That was good. So we will hope to have you back very soon, Gary. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you, Gary. So there you have it. Another episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture with Gary Lachman and C Lethbridge and Bowie and Blondie and Hedgehog made it in there just at the end. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And you can find out more about us at bureauoflostculture.com. We'll be back next time with yet more tales from the counterculture. I am Stephen Coates. See you, hear you then.